The committee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation of the rules. Transnational criminal and terrorist groups in Latin America are a threat to the United States national security. Some of the main players on this battlefield are FARC in Colombia and Shining Path in Peru, and even Hezbollah. The DEA has solid evidence showing stronger ties between FARC and Hezbollah. Hezbollah operatives Ayman Junah smuggled over 90,000 tons of cocaine into America and laundered over $250 million for the cartels. Jamal Yusuf, also Hezbollah agent, agreed to provide military-grade weapons to FARC in exchange for hundreds of kilograms of cocaine. Hezbollah and FARC maintain an operational alliance, much of which occurs under the protection of the Venezuelan regime. Other illicit Hezbollah activity occurs in the dangerous tri-border area. The activities of these groups include drug trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, and weapons shipments. In Peru, Shining Path is the main terrorist organization. Shining Path recruits children to participate in the drug activity, also forcing them to fight on the front lines. We have seen progress, however, in the fight against Shining Path. U.S. assistance was critical to kicking them out of an area called San Martin. Our assistance helped eradicate cocaine crops, give farmers alternative crops to plant, and take out leaders of Shining Path. This past August, 2 of the group's top leaders were killed. I had the opportunity to go to San Martin last fall. I saw Peruvians working in the heat of the day, pulling up one by one the cocaine crops. They were trying to make their country a safer place. I also visited a farm that stopped growing cocaine. The matriarch was a strong-willed woman whose husband was killed by drug violence. When this happened, she decided she had seen enough, and now she grows some of the best quality chocolate in the world. 10 years ago, even the Peruvian government could not set foot in the region. Today, Shining Path is nowhere to be found, and it's known as the San Martin Miracle, or San Martin Miracle. But the war is not won. Up to 500 members of the Shining Path are holding on in a hard region known as Rayburn. More than 50% of all cocaine produced in Peru comes from this region. There are a few roads that go in and out of the rugged terrain, but drug traffickers fly about 6 flights a day out of Rayburn into neighboring countries. President Humala has doubled down on the taking out of Shining Path. For the first time in its history, the government of Peru is now spending its own money on drug eradication. And now President Humala is preparing to go into the room and smoke these bandits out. Now's not the time when we have the Shining Path on the run for the United States to stop its help. We need to help Peru finish this job. In Colombia, the FARC is the main enemy. Thanks in part to over $100 million of U.S. assistance and training, the FARC has never been weaker. FARC went from 20,000 members in 2004 to 7,000 today. But FARC is still a serious threat. No longer able to execute large and high-profile attacks, they are going back to their guerrilla warfare. They have increased small-scale attacks on the military and government workers in the last 2 years. They are getting more involved in the drug trade. Some say they are even morphing into their own criminal organization. The Colombian government is negotiating with FARC as we speak. So far, the two sides have tentatively agreed on what political participation would look like in some of the rural development and land reform. Now, the ball is in FARC's court to see if the talks are going to progress. FARC has to decide if it's willing to give up its weapons and change their criminal behavior. It's not clear if these negotiations are going to work. Any deal is not necessarily a good deal. FARC's senior leaders might enjoy a deal, but the foot soldiers won't benefit much. If that happens, there is a chance that the lower ranks will fracture and form their own separate criminal or terrorist organizations, and the problem may only grow. We've seen progress in both Colombia and Peru, and I want to know from our witnesses what lessons we can learn from this progress and how we can help fight other terrorist organizations. It remains to be seen if this progress can be sustained. We have not yet achieved victory against these two groups, and I look forward to hearing what our witnesses think U.S. policy should be going forward to make sure we can finish the job. I'll now turn over for his opening statement the ranking member, Mr. Sherman from California.
Thank you, Judge, for holding these hearings. We'll focus particularly on Colombia and Peru, which have struggled with insurgencies for decades. These conflicts have a long and complicated history. Additionally, the neighboring states and various non-state actors have used the region as a battleground and as a base to advance their interests. I want our witnesses to particularly focus on three things: the involvement of Hezbollah, the exploitation of drugs, and human trafficking. The insurgent activity in Peru has been reduced in strength and territory from its peak in the 1980s and the 1990s. Current assessments of the insurgency known as Shining Path consist of only a few hundred armed members. At one point, this insurgency had at least 5,000 armed fighters. Shining Path operations have been mostly limited to the most remote rural areas. The Shining Path is a militant movement founded by a former university professor who's now in prison. Its goal was to destroy the Peruvian government and replace it with a revolutionary peasant authority using Mao-style guerrilla warfare. Engaging in massacres and assassinations, Shining Path posed a threat to the Peruvian government and institutions at the height of its activity. The conflict led to 70,000 deaths, most of whom were civilians. Alberto Fujimori, then president, had led a counterinsurgency campaign that improved national security, but according to many human rights groups, came at the cost of many human rights violations. Shining Path began a minor resurgence in 2001. It currently has two competing factions constituting a low-level threat in certain mountainous and hard-to-reach Andean regions. There was a split over whether or not to pursue a peace process, with one faction expressing interest in those negotiations. According to the State Department's most recent country report on terrorism, the Shining Path committed 87 acts of terrorism in 2012, killing 1 civilian and 13 members of the military, 5 police officers, for a total of 19 people. Turning to Colombia, the State Department's annual report, annual country reports on terrorism in 2012, which was issued in May of last year, indicates that the majority of terrorist acts in Latin America were perpetrated by the FARC. One organization, the majority of terrorist acts on the entire continent, in fact, the entire region. FARC is a group of mostly rural insurgents who, since the organization's founding in 1964, have sought to overthrow the Colombian government. FARC grew steadily over the decades and drew resources from drug trafficking, extortion, other illicit activities. The FARC portrays itself as a struggle against Colombia's systematic inequality. The FARC was declared to be a foreign terrorist organization by the United States in 1997, and in that same year, so was the Shining Path of Peru. Both are still listed. It's believed that its high point in the early 2000s, FARC had approximately 16, even 20,000 troops. It's now down to about half that strength. Reports indicate that some 220,000 people have died in the course of Colombia's conflict, and of course the vast majority of those were civilians. The war with FARC entered a very different phase over the course of the implementation of Plan Colombia. The United States appropriated over $9 billion this century to carry out that plan. I know our witnesses will assess for us the impact of that aid. Under Plan Colombia and its subsequent strategies, the country's made considerable progress in combating drug trafficking and insurgent activities. However, here again, we hear human rights groups citing elements with the Colombian military, working with right-wing paramilitary forces, and abusing human rights. There have, of course, been tensions with Colombia's neighbors, most especially Venezuela, but there also has been FARC operations in Ecuador, Panama, and Peru. I look forward to learning more from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Without objection, all of the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record, and I will ask that each witness keep their presentation to 5 minutes. I'll introduce all 4 witnesses, and then we'll hear from our first witness. Dr. Gino Costa is the head of the Ciudad Nostra, an NGO specialized in citizen security and police reform. Prior to that, he worked in the UN Center for Human Rights in Geneva and the UN missions in Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. He served as Executive Secretary of the Ad Hoc Pardons Commission set up by the Peruvian government in 1996 to review terrorism conviction and was Deputy Ombudsman for Human Rights from 1997 to 2000. Mrs. Selena Rialio, is that right? Close enough? Is Professor of Practice at the William J. Perry Center for Hemisphere Defense Studies at the National Defense University, where she focuses on U.S. national security, illicit networks, transnational organized crime, counterterrorism, and threat finance issues in the Americas. She's a former U.S. diplomat, international banker with Goldman Sachs, and a U.S. foreign policy advisor under the Clinton and Bush administrations. Mr. Douglas Farah is the Senior Non-Resident Associate at the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Since January of 2005, he has also been the President of the IBI Consultants. His focus is on the transnational criminal organizations, terrorism, and their effects on states and corruption, with a focus on the Western Hemisphere. And he serves as consultant to several U.S. government departments, agencies, combatant commands, and leading academic centers in the United States and overseas. Mr. Michael Shifter is the President of the Inter-American Dialogue. Since 1993, has been adjunct professor at Latin American politics at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Before joining the Dialogue, he directed the Latin American and Caribbean program at the National Endowment for Democracy and the Ford Foundation Governance and Human Rights program in the Andean region in Southern Cone. Dr. Costa will give his opening statement, and we will proceed directly to members' questions from him. We will then end the video conference with him and hear from our remaining witnesses. Dr. Costa, thank you for joining us from Peru. Thank you also for waiting some time. And you may now give us your statement, and then we will go directly to questions from the panel and then hear our testimony from our other 3 witnesses.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade. I very much appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. In 1992, 12 years after the beginning of the armed conflict, the most important leaders of the Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement were captured by the police, and the military forces were almost completely dismantled. Since then, the leaders of both groups have been in prison, and military actions have almost disappeared. This victory was a result of excellent police intelligence in urban areas and an alliance between the armed forces and rural peasants in the countryside. Holdovers from the Shining Path retreated to mountainous, inhospitable, and inaccessible areas located in the coca-growing regions of the Brain and the upper Guayaga valleys, where they engage in sporadic actions to obstruct efforts by the security forces to eradicate illicit crops and fight drug trafficking. In February 2012, 20 years later, Comrade Artemio, the Shining Path leader in the Guayaga Valley, was detained by the police. Thus, one of the 2 armed holdovers of the Shining Path was effectively dismantled. Artemio's downfall was a result of a prolonged and successful intelligence effort which involved the counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism police. Previously, police actions had led to the arrest or killing of Artemio's most important supporters. Progress in security went hand in hand with the eradication of illicit coca, alternative development efforts, and a growing state presence. Although illicit crops remain, they are shrinking in number, and the valley has turned into a peaceful region, a condition which has been described as the San Martin miracle. Unlike the Huallaga Valley, the strategy against the Shining Path in the LatAm was led by the military, and the role of the police was negligible until fairly recently. The strategy, implemented a decade ago, was basically defensive and consisted of the establishment of military bases for the purpose of containing the Shining Path expansion. Between 2008 and 2009, the armed forces went on the offensive in order to take control of the Shining Path headquarters in the Vizcatan region. After initially retreating, the Shining Path counterattacked by ambushing and killing dozens of soldiers and police agents, and even disrupting its air support, forcing the military to withdraw in defeat with not one Shining Path soldier detained or killed. Artemio's capture made evident that the unsuccessful military strategy in the LatAm had to be replaced by the successful police strategy carried out in the Huallaga Valley. It was not easy for the military to acknowledge that the police had to play the lead role in the counter-terrorist effort. The decision was finally made by President Humala, who decided to integrate the intelligence activities of the counter-narcotics police, the counter-terrorist police, and the Peruvian Navy, which together form a special intelligence brigade under police leadership. This brigade, with the support of all the branches of the armed forces, made it possible to strike on an ad hoc basis. It was this new strategy that led to the killing of Comrade William in September 2012 and Comrades Alipio and Gabriel in August of 2013, the three most important Shining Path military leaders and the number 5, 2, and 4 of its command structure, respectively. The Shining Path has been dealt a very hard blow, but it is still a long way from being defeated. Estimates of its strength in the LatAm vary between 140 armed men and somewhere between 400 and 500. It is essential to take advantage of its current weakness to capture and kill what is left of its leadership, Comrades Jose, Raúl, and Olga, and dismantling its military apparatus. U.S. assistance through DEA has been instrumental in the progress thus far achieved and should be sustained to ensure the defeat of what is left of the Shining Path. The achievement of the last 2 years demonstrate the effectiveness of the new strategy, which could be helpful to confront terrorist groups elsewhere. This strategy consists of prioritizing police intelligence work, which should combine human intelligence with electronics, telephone and radio listeners. Good intelligence facilitates more precise police operations in the field to capture or hit the main leaders of the terrorist organizations. Military involvement in these command operations can be very helpful. It is crucial to ensure the legality of intelligence and operational actions so that these cases may be prosecuted by the judicial system. An effort of this nature requires only a small number of participants, but highly professional ones that generally come from various units and institutions. Thus, it is essential that their actions be properly coordinated and conducted at the highest possible level.
Thank you, Dr. Costa. It's good to see you again. I'll start with the questions. There are reports that the United States government is looking at cutting some of the aid to Peru. What impact will this have on the fight against Shining Path? And second, what impact will it have on drug eradication?
The U.S. government has already been cutting down its cooperation to Peru. So the information that it might cut it further is not good news for the fight against what is left of Sendero and the fight against drug trafficking in Peru. So we do hope that an effort can be made to sustain the support provided by the U.S. government to the Peruvian government, especially to make sure that we can finish what is left of the Shining Path. I do think that the U.S. support is crucial. It has been crucial, and we need to continue with that support. Regarding the fight against drug trafficking and illicit crops, the Peruvian government has been increasing its budget to finance what a few years ago was exclusively an effort funded by U.S. resources. And we hope that in the coming years that national effort will increase to make sure that we can deal on our own with the need to confront drug trafficking in Peru. Still, we also need, in this regard, sustained support by the U.S. government. But I want to stress that I think that the most important threat now is to deal with the violent expression of drug trafficking in Peru, and there is a need to get the job finished before retreating from Peru.
If you would, be a little more specific on U.S.-Peruvian counterterrorism efforts and give us some detail as to what has been effective, what has been the most successful strategy between Peru and the United States on counterterrorism.
As I said, Chairman Poe, as I said in my statement, it's been crucial for the progress achieved regarding the Shining Path to ensure the quality of the intelligence work that has been carried out. And in this regard, the support of the U.S. has been very important in terms of training, in terms of providing equipment for electronic intelligence, and in terms of following and accompanying the efforts of the security forces in Peru. There's also been resources provided by the U.S. government to recompensas,
compensate.
To compensate for those that provide information that could lead to the detention of Shining Path leaders. So I think that would be the most important aspects of U.S. cooperation with Peruvian security forces. Regarding the fight against the Shining Path, of course there's a drugs program in Peru which is also very important. It's been instrumental for the success of the San Martin experience regarding the eradication of illicit crops and alternative development strategies. But as I said before, the Peruvian government in the last 2 years have been investing of its own resources to be able to compensate for the reduction in the U.S. support in this regard.
Do you know of any evidence that Shining Path is working with FARC or other Mexican drug cartels?
No, we don't have any, I don't have any information regarding relations between what is left of the Shining Path and Hezbollah or the FARC or even the Mexican or Colombian cartels themselves. There's no doubt that the Shining Path is related to the drug traffic. The most important source for the funding of its activities comes from drug trafficking, and mainly from the support and protection that it provides drug trafficking in the Brain. But I don't have information as to direct relations between the Shining Path and the Mexican and the Colombian cartels.
Thank you, Dr. Costa. Now the ranking member, Mr. Sherman, for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman. The Shining Path is split into two organizations, one with the initials SL.FRAEM, the other SLUHV. Would you think either one of these will reach a peace accommodation with the Peruvian government?
Actually, there were two. I mentioned that after the defeat of the Shining Path, the strategic defeat of the Shining Path in the early 90s, there were two armed holdovers, one in the Guayaba Valley and one in the Brain. The holdover in the Guayaba Valley, headed by Artemio, wanted a peace accord with the government. And Artemio followed the line, the political direction of Abimael Guzman, imprisoned for life in the Peruvian naval base. But Artemio was detained, as I said in my statement 2 years ago. And after his detention, the whole military apparatus led by Artemio collapsed and was dismantled. So actually today we only have one Shining Path group, which is the one left in the Braim. They have no relation with the leadership of Abimael Guzman and Artemio. They believe that Guzman has betrayed the Peruvian revolution, and they follow a different line. So in military terms, all we have left today is one Shining Path group concentrated in the Braim that has no relation with the historical leadership of the Shining Path.
Thank you for that update. President Fujimori was convicted not only of corruption but also of stated crimes against humanity and human rights abuses. How does the human rights behavior of the current Peruvian government compare to those practiced under President Fujimori?
I do believe that we have learned the lesson. Currently, there are no serious allegations of human rights abuses against the security forces in the context of the fight against the Shining Path in the Braim or previously the Shining Path in the Guayaba Valley, nor any serious allegations regarding the conduction of our anti-drug policy in those two valleys and a number of other valleys where the coca leaf is produced.
Obviously, the Shining Path is a much less dangerous organization than it was in its heyday. Peru is a mid-income country. Why can't the Peruvian government deal with this and other issues of national security and drug interdiction without help from the United States taxpayer?
We are certainly dealing with the problem, but we certainly benefit a lot from U.S. assistance. We are well aware of, the budgetary and fiscal problems you are facing in the United States. And as I said before, we have been making a very important effort to compensate for the reduction in U.S. cooperation regarding the fight against drugs and the fight against the Shining Path. As I said before, I think it would be very important to ensure that U.S. cooperation can be sustained at least until we finish what is left of the Shining Path. And that's what I would hope. I think it's also as Chairman Poe said at the beginning of his presentation, that this is also in the interest of in the national interest of the U.S. government.
Thank you.
We'll now hear from questions from the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and sir, thank you for being here. I'm actually I fly an RC-26, which is a intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance airplane, and I believe Peru actually has the same asset. You talked a lot about the use of intelligence in terms of finishing off these groups or in terms of taking the fight to them anywhere else that this replicates. Where does Peru stand right now in terms of having enough of those assets without U.S. help, and where do they need to be in order to be able to effectively to finish this fight and take it to the bad guys?
We do have the wherewithal to deal with a problem. But part of that wherewithal is being provided by the U.S. government. So, as I said before, that's one of the reasons why I do believe that it would be helpful to continue receiving U.S. assistance, especially regarding intelligence and electronic intelligence.
Okay. Also, so now to kind of tie this to the issue we deal with in the Middle East and in other places, what is the risk right now? What do you see the risk of if we let up on this fight in Peru? What do you see the future as? Are they going to stay, 500 people? Do you see the risk of this expanding yet again? And on top of that, I want you to talk about the difference between what drives this group, Shining Path, and what drives, for instance, Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, which is a jihadist group driven by religion, versus kind of a political ideology. Could you talk about the difference and the risk associated with that issue?
Yeah, if we would be having this conversation 2 years ago, we would certainly be much more concerned because the strategy to deal with Sendero was failing until we managed to strike Artemio in the Guayaga and then implement the new strategy to deal with the Shining Path in the Brahim. And now we expect to be able to conclude the job if we insist in applying this new strategy. But two years ago, the feeling was that we were losing this battle, that the Shining Path, especially in the Brahim, was area of influence was increasing, and its military presence was threatening the transportation of natural gas from the Camisea region in El Cusco to the coast and mainly to the capital in Lima. That natural gas accounts for around 40% of the energy we consume in the country. That threat is still there. We know that part of the funding of Sendero comes from extortion to the gas companies that are responsible for the transportation of the natural gas from Cusco to Lima. So that's the kind of threat and what concerns us the most with Sendero, the possibility of Sendero recovering the lost territory it had in the early 90s, threatening the supply of natural gas, 40% of the energy we consume in the country. But we are aware that it is more a local than an international threat in this moment. As I said before, we don't have information that it has contacts with international terrorist groups. There's a discussion within Peru whether Sendero is today the military expression of drug trafficking in Peru, or if it is still a political group. I do believe that it is still a political group, although its interest with drug trafficking and illegal logging and extortion to gas companies it makes of this group also an organization involved in common crime. But I think there are great differences between the Shining Path and Al-Qaeda and this sort of movements in the Middle East.
Thank you, and I'll just conclude by saying I think it's important when you have a group like this on their heels, this is where we tend to sometimes make the decision to let up because we are eager to have a fight over. And I think this is when it's important to double down pressure and extinguish existing terrorist groups. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. 5 minutes for the gentleman from Arkansas. Mr. Cotton. All right. He yields back his time. Mr. Costa, Dr. Costa, I want to thank you for joining us today by video conference. We appreciate your testimony and your answers to all of the questions. And I also want to thank the U.S. Embassy for helping to set this up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We will now turn to the witnesses at the present in the hearing room. Thank you for waiting. Mrs. Rialio, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to appear today before you to testify on the convergence of illicit networks in Latin America. I'm a professor of practice at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, but the views expressed today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Perry Center, the National Defense University, or the Defense Department. Globalization has transformed our lives positively with the free flow of goods, services, information, and technology. However, at the same time, globalization has empowered illicit networks, including terrorists, criminals, and proliferators that undermine our prosperity and security. Terrorists have political objectives while criminals seek to maximize profits. What we're witnessing today is a disturbing convergence of terrorism and crime from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of Latin America that threatens the rule of law, governments, the economy, and society. In contrast to indigenous terrorist groups like the FARC in Colombia and the Shining Path, Hezbollah, the Shiite Muslim political group in Lebanon, designated by the United States as a foreign terrorist organization, operates inside and outside of Lebanon. It relies on significant support from Iran and the Lebanese Shiite diaspora community around the world. As you know, before the tragic attacks of September 11th perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah was the terrorist group responsible for the most U.S. casualties from terrorist attacks since its founding in 1982. More recently, Hezbollah has been in the headlines for actively supporting and fighting alongside President Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. Hezbollah and its global facilitators represent an emerging terror crime nexus through its networks in the Middle East, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere. Since the 1990s, Hezbollah has enjoyed ideological and financial support from the Lebanese community in the tri-border area of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, a region known for arms, drugs, counterfeit, and human trafficking. 3 more recent cases illustrates Hezbollah's increasing reliance on facilitators engaged in criminal activities beyond the tri-border of South America. In 2008, Operation Titan, a 2-year joint U.S.-Colombian investigation, dismantled an international cocaine smuggling and money laundering ring that allegedly directed part of its profits to Hezbollah. Among the 130 suspects arrested was Lebanese kingpin Chekri Harb, accused of being a world-class money launderer. According to Colombian officials, he laundered millions of dollars each year from Panama to Hong Kong and paid some 12% of his profits to Hezbollah. In a separate case, Ayman Juma, a Lebanese Colombian national and critical facilitator for Hezbollah, was indicted in absentia in November 2011 for distributing 85,000 kilograms of cocaine from Colombia through Central America to the Los Zetas cartel in Mexico. He's also accused of laundering $850 million of drug money from Mexico, Europe, and West Africa to Colombia and Venezuela. Juma allegedly charged between 8 to 14% for laundering the funds and directed some of his profits to Hezbollah. This partnership between a prominent Hezbollah facilitator and Los Zetas, Mexico's most violent cartel, is a disturbing development illustrating the convergence of terrorism and crime. The most recent case of Hezbollah's global facilitators involved the now-defunct Lebanese-Canadian Bank, Lebanon's 8th largest bank with assets worth over $5 billion. According to the DEA, this bank and some Lebanese exchange houses wired at least $329 million from 2007 to 2011 to the United States to finance a sophisticated illicit trade and money laundering scheme. This network moved drugs from South America to Europe and the Middle East and purchased used cars in the U.S. to be shipped and sold in West Africa. Cash from the car sales, as well as from the drug trafficking, were funneled to Lebanon through Hezbollah-controlled money laundering channels. On June 23, 2013, Lebanese-Canadian Bank agreed to pay here in the United States a settlement of $102 million. It's just a fraction of the amount of money allegedly laundered by this institution. In the age of globalization, the convergence of terror crime networks is capitalizing on global resources, supply chains, markets, and facilitators. The Operation Titan, Ayman Juma, Lebanese-Canadian Bank cases illustrate how Hezbollah relies on criminal activities and support from overseas among the Lebanese diaspora in Latin America. Drug trafficking, money laundering, and illicit trade in Latin America that fund Hezbollah are impacting U.S. consumers, financial institutions, and markets. While according to the State Department, Hezbollah may not be currently plotting terrorist attacks in the United States or Latin America, we must remain vigilant and prepare for potential threats. The 2011 White House strategies to combat terrorism and transnational organized crime seek to channel the appropriate USG resources to address these threats. To confront the convergence of illicit networks, we need to promote more effective interagency and international cooperation to better understand, analyze, and counter these illicit networks. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions.
The Chair recognizes Mr. Is it Farah or Farah? Mr. Farah, 5 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Sherman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity here to talk about the FARC and lessons learned for the United States. I should clarify that I am speaking on behalf of myself and not any institution. I believe the U.S. government, the U.S.-Colombia partnership is one of the most successful in recent times. I've had the privilege of working in Colombia since 1989 and have seen the nation teeter on the edge of the abyss in the 1990s to emerge as a regional model of democracy and economic development. The FARC, despite the ongoing peace talks with the government of President Juan Manuel Santos in Cuba, remain engaged in criminal enterprises and terrorist activities that stretch from Colombia to Argentina and northward to Central America and Mexico. Recent cases by the DEA show the direct and growing criminal and drug ties between the FARC and Hezbollah. As I detail in my testimony, the FARC, since at least 1999, has established a relationship with the government of Iran, designated by the United States government as a state sponsor of terrorism. The FARC was designated in 1997 following the kidnapping and executions of 7 American missionaries. The European Union followed suit in 2005. Under the protection of the governments of Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, as well as powerful friends elsewhere, the FARC maintains a robust international infrastructure that produces thousands of kilos of cocaine and launders hundreds of millions of dollars. It has emerged as a prototype hybrid criminal terrorist insurgency. It is not for me as a non-Colombian to judge the wisdom of holding peace talks, but what I can say is that the FARC is a central part of the revolutionary project of bringing together armed groups and terrorist organizations under the umbrella of the Bolivarian Revolution with the aid and support of Iran. The glue that binds these groups is a shared vision of creating a new world order in which the United States, Europe, and Israel are enemies to be destroyed. Their common doctrine of asymmetrical warfare explicitly endorses the use of weapons of mass destruction against their perceived enemies. Over the past 15 years, Colombia has undergone a profound transformation. This is testament to Colombia's own innovative and courageous policies and the sustained bipartisan U.S. Support that spanned 3 administrations and has led to a partnership that is unique in Latin America. During the 3-year peace negotiations that ended in February 2002 in Colombia, the FARC significantly expanded its outreach to other terrorist groups to increase its technical capabilities and establish relationships that endure to this day. Among the visitors to the FARC territory during the talks were the Iranian government officials, ostensibly to build a refrigerated meat storage facility. The plant was never built, but it provided the FARC leadership with direct contact with Iranian officials, a relationship that endures today through the Venezuelan government. ETA terrorists and other groups trained the FARC, and by 2003, the FARC was using techniques from these organizations in attacks that took hundreds of civilian lives. In my written testimony, I detail the support based on documents captured by Colombian security forces when they killed Raul Reyes in 2008 of these groups, as well as Hugo Chavez, Rafael Correa, Daniel Ortega, and Salvador Sanchez Seren, the leading candidate for president of El Salvador, and his fellow FMLN leader, José Luis Merino. The FARC Central American Network is among the most important in the current discussion because it is still active. Nicaraguan President Ortega offers refuge and financial aid to the FARC, and the Reyes documents show that when Reyes was killed, Merino in El Salvador was brokering a deal that included the sale of grenade launchers, 50 caliber machine guns, sophisticated explosives, and possibly surface-to-air missiles. Former U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador, William Walker, a friend of Merino, recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times defending the FMLN and dismissing his ties to the FARC, which he called a leftist movement rather than a terrorist organization. The right of the FMLN to participate in the electoral process is not in discussion, as Ambassador Walker mistakenly argues. But defending its leaders who supply weapons to a terrorist organization is shocking for a former U.S. envoy. There is significant evidence showing the FARC's operational alliance with Hezbollah and Hezbollah's allies based in Venezuela under the protection of the Maduro government. The evidence is compelling that both the FARC and Hezbollah are now engaged in a series of business relationships that involve cocaine and weapons trades. Despite this support, the FARC did not win. The Colombian people ultimately wanted to save their country. It was this will, welded to the political will of successive U.S. administrations to support them, that is perhaps our greatest lesson to be drawn. The U.S.-Colombia strategic partnership must continue for the foreseeable future, even if peace talks are successful. With or without a peace agreement, the Colombian government will require not only ongoing military and police support, but support in other areas of their vast undertaking of reestablishing a positive state presence in huge areas of the country where the government has been absent for generations. Failure to adequately address the continuing challenges could put at risk many of the hard-won gains achieved by the Colombians. There are several key lessons one can draw from Colombia that are applicable in other theaters. First is that there has to be a significant level of trust in a successful partnership there will be conflicts as we see in Afghanistan today. In Colombia, the trust led the United States to support some of the Colombian government's riskiest operations, including a hostage rescue that it would be almost impossible to imagine with any other ally. Second is that hybrid groups like the FARC, the Taliban in Afghanistan, and many others thrive in the seams of the world's illicit trade pipelines. The money from cocaine that the FARC has garnered has ensured that it has endured far longer than it would have as a simple insurgent group. All of these new groups are dangerous and far more difficult to attack than terrorist-generate groups of the past, given their enormous access to financial resources. None of these groups operate in a vacuum. Governments like those of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Ecuador create a permissive operational environment in which the FARC, Hezbollah, Iranian officials, ETA, and others can safely meet, exchange lessons learned, and work to build alliances. This is not to say there is one giant alliance of all these groups aimed at the United States. Rather, it is a deliberately created environment where these groups can trade expertise and make temporary alliances of mutual convenience, none of which will be of benefit to the United States. This is the danger of the FARC, and that danger is unlikely to diminish even with a successful peace process in in Colombia. Thank you.
Mr. Shifter, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Sherman and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate this opportunity today. Latin America's landscape is indeed changing. On balance, the changes have been positive. The region has had sustained growth. It's lowered its levels of poverty and inequality and has moving towards more democratic, pragmatic politics. On the negative side of the ledger, there's spreading criminality in many countries, often fueled by the drug trade and other illicit activities. The result is institutional weakness, corruption, and challenges to the rule of law. Colombia and Peru are among Washington's closest South American allies. The U.S. has trade agreements with both countries and cooperates with them in a variety of key areas. Both countries have ample experience in battling insurgencies, designated as terrorist groups by the State Department, that have sought to topple democratically elected governments. Fortunately, both the Shining Path in Peru and the FARC in Colombia have been substantially weakened militarily. They are still capable of inflicting some damage, but they no longer pose an existential threat to either the Peruvian or the Colombian states. The Shining Path, the Maoist movement that started in 1980, is perhaps one of the most ruthless insurgencies in Latin America. It stopped being such a significant strategic threat when its leader, Abimael Guzman, was captured in September of 1992. The success was the result of old-fashioned, painstaking police work and sound intelligence gathering. This was a top-down group, and when the leader went, the rest crumbled. Today, the Shining Path, as we just heard, is operating mainly in the Varai region in Peru. It is sustained by drug-related income. The Peruvians have applied intelligence techniques and other approaches that have been used successfully in Colombia with United States support to engage successful policy against the Shining Path in the Varai region. The U.S. provides currently about $55 million in counter-narcotics aid to Colombia, to Peru. 2014 is a big year. There are ambitious targets to destroy crops and illegal airstrips in Peru. There's one risk, which is that focusing on eradication of coca crops in Peru could possibly deprive peasant growers of their most viable source of income and heighten resentment against the Colombian military and the Colombian government, the Peruvian military and the Peruvian government. In the case of Colombia, the U.S. has provided far more substantial support, some $9 billion, since Plan Colombia was approved by the U.S. Congress in July of 2000. This has been complemented by support in intelligence gathering and coordination. This is a positive story of international cooperation. At a time when the FARC and the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia posed a threat in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and everybody was talking about a failed state, there was a response by the United States and by the Colombian government and by its society. The figures of success are dramatic: a reduction in homicides, reduction in kidnappings, an expansion of the defense budget, and police presence now in all of the country's municipalities. The sustained U.S. bipartisan support over a dozen years to Colombia, with the initial focus on security and increasingly on institutional support and alternative development, contributed to the turnaround. As the GAO report of 2008 indicated, there's been more progress on the security than on the drug issue, which remains a significant challenge for Colombia. The key to success was the commitment and will on the part of the Colombian government and major sectors of its society to mobilize and turn around a deteriorating situation. Today, faced with a military and politically weakened FARC, the Colombian government is pursuing a peace process. Colombians clearly support that process. It has moved a little bit more slowly than many expected. 2 of the 5 issues on the agenda have been covered, and President Santos now says he plans to conclude it this year. Thanks to the efforts of the Colombian government, including 8 years under the presidency of Álvaro Uribe, the process has a better chance of succeeding than it did in the past. It will not be easy. There is no guarantee. The most difficult, vexing question, in my opinion, is for how to deal with the FARC who are guilty of serious human rights crimes. This is an issue that remains to be addressed. Most Colombians want the FARC to pay for their crimes. The U.S. should sustain its support to a key strategic ally in South America. If a peace accord is reached, assistance will be helpful in post-conflict scenarios. And if an agreement is not reached, then Colombia would continue to benefit from aid for its social and justice reform agenda. The U.S. is rightly supporting President Santos' peace effort. There will be issues that will need to be addressed regarding U.S. counter-drug policy, but the goal should be to try to reach an agreement. That would be a big boost for Colombia, for the region, and for U.S. interests. At the same time, peace will not immediately come to pass. The FARC is likely to fragment and fracture. Other groups will look and take over the illicit activities that are now controlled and dominated by the FARC. If we look at the broader situation on Hezbollah, clearly there were a few cases when they sought to advance their cause in the region in Argentina in the early 1990s, aimed against Jewish targets. There is information, reliable information about ideological and financial support for these groups in the region, but no evidence that we know of operational cells. There's a lot of speculation and a lot of allegations, but a high standard of credible proof is critical. Organized crime is a major concern in many countries of the region. Colombia, fortunately, is now using U.S. support to help train Central American police and others to deal with their problem.
Sum up your testimony, please.
Thank you very much. The main emphasis of the U.S. to try to encourage development of democratic institutions, justice systems, and police forces. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll start with the questions. Mr. Farah and Mrs. Rialio, I don't know if any State Department officials are present for your testimony, but the State Department takes the position and insists that there is no real Hezbollah threat in Latin America, even though the Defense Department and the DEA have said otherwise. Do you know of why the State Department would take the position there's no Hezbollah? And the both of you just talked about it. Ladies first.
And having been a U.S. State Department official in the Counterterrorism Office, if you recall, after September 11th, we actually added, as well as al-Qaeda and affiliates, we added Hezbollah, Hamas, as well as the FARC and Tamil Tigers to that. And more importantly, I'm sad that we don't have a State Department colleague here with us to explain, but the bigger question is, perhaps we need to take a look at the mistakes we've committed in the past. We considered in the 1990s Osama bin Laden as just merely a money man for al-Qaeda. What we've described, I think, between Doug's and my testimony, and we actually work collaboratively together, is a lot of the fundraising you can't separate out when you look at terrorist organizations, because we consider the money as the oxygen for any activity, legal or illegal, and more importantly, for these lethal operations. So I think that's actually why the different agencies look at and define Hezbollah and its activities in the Western Hemisphere differently than perhaps a diplomatic stance. So as the State Department...
So diplomatically, we're in denial, and the ones that do the hard work, the DEA and the Department of Defense, say, yeah, those folks are really down in Latin America. You don't know why they... I mean, you've been very diplomatic in your statement. You used to work for the State Department. Mr. Farah, you want to weigh in on this issue?
I have had many discussions with senior State Department officials about this. Their view is that the intelligence community does not have compelling evidence of Hezbollah's operational activities in the region. I think part of the issue is resources, and part of the issue is that there are overwhelming issues both in Latin America and other parts of the world that make it difficult to isolate this out and focus on it as I think they should, perhaps a little more aggressively. And I think that one of the things that is lost in this is that starting in 2008, the DEA particularly, but other agencies, have built up a series of now public cases and a judicial record that clearly shows this involvement in transnational organized activities and the alliances that, between the FARC, Hezbollah, and many other trafficking organizations in the region. And it's not been put together into a timeline that can show, unless you really study it, to put the pieces together and say, holy cow, it's really there. But you keep hearing it's not there, we don't see the evidence, but it is there. It's just in many little pieces. And I think that that's one of the frustrations of people who deal with the issue on the ground and see it, is that it's hard to get through the policy perception that it's not there. And why that is, I honestly don't know.
Ms. Rialio, I want you to be specific. You said that Hezbollah works with the brutal drug cartel, the Zetas, operates out of Mexico. Be a little more specific about how they are partners in outlawry, if you will.
So actually what's quite interesting is if you think about the Lebanese Colombian community, those who support Hezbollah, and this is actually very important in terms of qualifying that it's a subset of the Lebanese diaspora community that supports Hezbollah and, more importantly, actively moves money and product for them. What they're doing is actually offering a service to cartels such as the Mexican Los Zetas cartel. What they were doing in the case of Ayman Juma, in the indictment that has been unsealed, is actually describe how they were helping to move cocaine towards the Mexican cartels and then also launder the money in the backflow. So it's a big question when we take a look at these types of groups of illicit actors, which includes terrorists, proliferators, and more importantly, criminals. A lot of them are actually offering and brokering services. They may not espouse the same kind of ideological fervor that other groups have. But what we're really disturbed by is the fact that they're finding a lot of these very specialized services, to which Doug has actually written about, these terror pipelines, where you see this very unholy alliance between terrorist groups and criminal groups who in the end have a win-win because they actually meet their long-term objectives in terms of that. And that's the one case that we've seen specifically documented through legal, kind of an actual indictment of Ayman Juma's interaction with Los Zetas.
And then Hezbollah uses the money maybe for other Hezbollah activities somewhere else.
And that's the part that's actually worrying us as they step up operations in the Middle East. They need to finance and support their militants.
And Mr. Farah briefly explained a little more detail the connection between Hezbollah and the FARC in Colombia.
I think if you look at Operation Titan, which then grew into, going forward into the Ayman Juma case, they're all interconnected. You saw for the first time in 2008 Hezbollah operatives directly buying product from the FARC. That hadn't been seen before. There were rumors of it, there were suspicions of it, but in large quantities, and where a significant amount of the profits, the FARC benefited on the front end directly from selling the cocaine, and then the sale profits, a large parts of them filtered back in directly into Hezbollah. And that was a well-documented, again, an open-source judicial case that the Colombians worked with the Americans on for 2 years. An Ayman Juma case grew out of that. Again, you had direct purchase from FARC, 48th Front on the Ecuadorian border and others, where the money then moved. So the FARC benefits clearly on the front end. Hezbollah benefits from this skimming off the percentages, as was mentioned, of the money that it doesn't all go to Hezbollah, but a significant amount of that revenue does. And then you have to look, I think, at the state sponsorship or the protection of the states like Venezuela that allow these groups to operate with impunity, which really cuts down on their operating costs. If you're not worried about getting caught, you can do a lot more things than you otherwise would do. And I think that is one of the primary issues where you see the FARC being very active with a heavy Iranian presence is in Bolivia. And I think you have to look at how states support mitigates the cost and the threat to these groups.
Thank you. Ranking Member Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. We're focused here on Colombia and Peru. If we're going to focus on a third or fourth country, what would it be? Where should we be concerned?
Probably a region. It's actually Central America, because of the fact that actually if we think about the balloon effect, which we've talked about a lot in terms of this topic, as Colombia and Peru become much more effective in terms of countering and have real assets and are actually growing economies, Central America, unfortunately, has become now the new ungoverned territory, if you want to call that, for these cartels to move, not just drugs, by the way. There are tons of other illicit products and activities, and sadly, human trafficking has become now in the headlines, which I know it's a topic of interest to you.
Thank you. Mr. Farah.
I would add Argentina. I think if you look at the funnel of the way the drug trafficking patterns have developed as the movement of cocaine downstream, you have Bolivia now producing HCl in large quantities, Peru, Brazil has cut off its borders, Chile has protected its borders, and you have one giant funnel going down to the one country that, one, has a very high consumption rate, and two, uncontrolled border traffic to West Africa and Europe, which is Argentina.
So from a drug perspective, Argentina, what from about the perspective of ideologically driven terrorist organizations?
I think you see both. I think you see the rapprochement between Argentina and Iran, which I think is one of the really troubling areas. I think in terms of where they're active and where they're raising money, Panama is where Hezbollah is probably.
There are people in Panama who take money out of their own pocket.
No, this is where they take money from other people's pockets and buy dual-use equipment and all kinds of weapons, and completely uncontrolled. Then the pre-trade zones, particularly, I would say that where their money flows through, not where they're generating the revenue.
So Panama is a place for Hezbollah to go on a shopping spree, not a place where they're going.
As well as Iran, yes, absolutely.
Yes. And Mr. Schiffer?
I would say Central America, especially the northern triangle of Central America, Honduras and Guatemala, in terms of the drug trafficking, and in terms of ideological affinity, I think you could find. Venezuela is still is a problem that deserves a lot of attention as well.
Now, Plan Colombia has cost us $9 billion. The request for the administration is $323 million, including almost half of that for economic support. Colombia is considerably better off economically than many countries that get little or no economic support from the United States. Colombia has been substantially successful. Why do we need to honor the President's request for $323 million, and particularly his request for $140 million of economic support? Mr. Shifter?
Well, I think Colombia, first of all, is assuming a larger responsibility than they had in the past, and I think that number request has gone down from what it was a number of years ago. I also think that the United States has made a huge investment in Colombia over a dozen years. This is a success story, and I think it's in our interest to do what we can to make sure
I see in foreign policy,
that's sustainable.
Everywhere we do something, that's where we've got to put more. Where we put our blood, we have to put more of our blood. Where our money, more than our money. Iraq is the most important country in the Arab Middle East because Americans have died there. And everywhere we've made an effort, we have a stake in continuing that effort. It is frustrating. I'd like to see someone come before us and say, we've been so successful we don't need any more money. How large the natural affinity for Hezbollah will come among some portion of the Lebanese Shiite community. How large a Lebanese Shiite community is there in several of the countries we've talked about, and what portion of that community has an ideological adherence to Hezbollah?
They're all off. Mine's working.
And they get that protection because the governments want money, or they just want to stick it to us? You're saying that books that equate liberation theology with Shiite Islam then motivate the Panamanian or Ecuadorian governments to take action which otherwise wouldn't be in their national interest? Yeah. Thank you.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. You just touched on what I wanted to talk. Are we all right? What I wanted to touch on here was the coming together of all these organizations, FARC, Hezbollah, the Shining Path. It seems like they're on the run, coming together for that commonality, and that is against the United States, European powers, and to me that is the danger. And what we saw was FARC had been there was good control put on them, and their numbers went down. But yet, what we're seeing, it seems like a increase in the techniques, the military capabilities of them, bombing and roadside bombs on the military and the police in Colombia. They seem to become more violent and more dangerous. And with this coming together, with us as the targets, my questions are: is there any idea how much illicit traffic and trade, and what type of that is coming through our southern borders? Not just our southern, but our eastern and western shores, and maybe even our northern borders, through this organization of the TOCs.
I think that in my research, I think that that's I don't think we know how much, but I think that if you look at what crosses our border in terms of illicit products, they probably have a better delivery rate than FedEx or UPS. You know, if you put something in an illicit pipeline from Venezuela and want it to get across our border, it will get there.
Where do you see most of that coming through? The southern border or on the coast?
The southern border. I think that they now have the capability to use the submersibles now that can get all the way to California. I think one of the concerns in the security community is that they know that the submersibles exist. They can carry tons of anything, and they can reach our coast without refueling now, and we can't find them very easily. And I think that that's one of the great unknowns out there.
Okay, so not just our southern border, but our shorelines, east and west, is a national security interest that we should monitor these and secure them. Would you say that we're in agreement there from a national security standpoint?
Sure. I think securing borders...
How about the other two members? Are you guys in agreement with that? It's a national security threat that we should address?
Yes, because if you think about the types of people and products that are actually penetrating the borders, that are marketed and pushed by these illicit networks, they're actually directly affecting American consumers. So we have this tragic case of this very famous actor who was found, we allegedly think, from a heroin overdose. And many people who work in this field are suspecting that the heroin probably originated from or is trafficked by Mexican cartels. Because there have been reports now that the Mexican consumption of the United States of cocaine is actually at its lowest levels ever. But that's not to say prescription drugs, methamphetamine, and heroin has actually been on the rise. So since there is a market still here in the United States for these types of illicit drugs, we're creating a market, and obviously because of the financial incentive and to empower themselves, these groups look for the governance gaps on our borders, maritime or land, in order to actually get the product and people here into their market.
And what we're seeing is the rise of heroin. I read a report the other day that said children under the age of 18 to 25 in the last 5 or 10 years, 20% of them have tried heroin. And it's a rise because drugs like Oxycontin have gotten so high that heroin is so cheap. And I think it's a very dangerous thing that we need to bring under control. The other thing is I know several people in the Coast Guard. These people are out there and they're running into these people. If not yet, they're going to. And these people are going to be well armed with military assets, and it's going to put our military and our Coast Guard at a high risk, and this is something that we need to bring under control. What other ways do you see that we can fight this war on the narco-terrorist organizations, other than a perpetual war on drugs or a war on terror through maybe policy change or a paradigm shift to the United States of America?
Well, here in the United States, we have to start to raise awareness of the average citizen. I'm from New York City. There was tons of campaigns and ads about human trafficking, which we'd never seen at a large, major metropolis sporting event.
We're running those in our district, too.
And you saw that as well. There was a huge takedown of these syndicates that were actually trafficking not just people, but also counterfeit goods that could actually harm consumers. So there's a big push about awareness on the demand side. Then on the actual supply side and interdiction, we've actually seen, and I think the cases of Peru and Colombia illustrate how good intelligence and good cooperation and coordination tactically, but also strategically in terms of political will, can actually bear some kind of influence to constrain the operating environments of
Thank
these
you. I'm out of time. I have to cut you off. Thank you, ma'am.
I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. It's been very informative, and thank you for the information that you have given us. This subcommittee hearing is adjourned.